in the other room with our three screaming boys. Okay, there you go. So I wanted to tell you an amazing story, Dr. Goldish. About 2 years ago, in my Facebook fan page, I was contacted by an individual in Istanbul. And he wasn't Jewish. He was just an individual that was very well read. I think he saw my book, Secret Jews. So he contacted me. We started conversing, and he said, listen, my family has connections to the Don Me. And I began to ask him about this, like, do they still exist? He goes, yeah, there are. And, he talked about the older generation, the younger people, but according to him, it was, several hundred people. And, he said that, of course, they're very secretive. They don't like to talk about it. But I was just fascinated by that because out of the blue, this individual contacted me. And of course, I had read your book, Sabbatean Prophets, which I was just amazed with. And so it was just like, perfect timing on that. And yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. So,
Oh,
yeah, it
I
was
was
just a
just going to
fascinating
say
story.
the Ma'aminim are definitely around, and there are a fair number of them, and they have a network, and they actually have an online group that invites people occasionally to speak to them about the Sabbatean movement, about they I recently was informed that dolmeh is a little bit of a
pejorative, I suppose.
pejorative,
I see.
right?
Okay.
Hadar Feldman at the Association for Jewish Studies conference, who's one of the leading scholars of the dolmeh, if not the top person, said, "Well, it's not a nice term. I had no idea." But anyway, I've spoken a couple of times to their group. They're around. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
Amazing.
it is just amazing that they have survived into the 21st century.
It's incredible. Well, I think without any further ado, people will join as they come in. Our group tends to be somewhat late on Shabbat. I can tell you that for sure. But in any case, it's a great pleasure for us to have Dr. Matt Goldish with us. He's a professor at Ohio State University, and he also has taught at the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership, which is my alma mater. I studied with Rabbi Byron Sherwin of blessed memory and many individuals there. And as I was mentioning to those who were here at the very beginning, I think one of the first times that I came across your work was the Sabbatean Prophets. And I'm an engineer by day, in addition to all my other activities. And I just read the book and I was just amazed because the characteristics, the way that you described the Sabbateans, it reminded me of what I would see like on TV. If you're flipping the channels and you come across, you know, Christian television, just at a hotel or something, the way that you described it in the book and in a lecture, it was just amazing to me. It was almost like I could sort of see it live, if you will. And it was just something that I really carried with me. And of course, my own studies on Anusim and B'nai Anusim and Conversos and so forth, it just really made for a topic that I think is just so fascinating. And so without any further ado, I don't want to take away your time. Please, jump in, take us where you want to go. And thank you so much for this privilege.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. Katonti, istafele. I appreciate it, and honored to be here. I will I'll tell you what I will do is turn on my chat box. So if anybody wants to throw in a question or a thought, you can just write it into the chat and I'll see it. I didn't know quite where to start, so I'm going to start way back and sort of put together the pieces of the Jewish world a little bit at the time that we are discussing. And if I'm just going back over things everybody knows, I apologize, but we'll sort of, since the talk really is focusing on Sephardim, Anusim, Italians, Romaniotes. So we'll kind of just get the picture of where everybody is. And I hope that's okay. And I'll spend a few minutes on that and then get to the Sabbateans. So here's where I'm going to start. The destruction of the Second Temple. Okay. It's Jerusalem, 70 of the Common Era, and many, many Jews are killed and many are exiled from our land. And many of them, since the invaders were the Romans, many of them end up in Roman territories, in other words, in Italy. So there are other Jews, a very large concentration of Jews, other places. There are lots of Jews who are living in Egypt at that time. There are lots of Jews who are living in Persia at that time. So the general historiography goes like this, that the Jews who are exiled from the land of Israel, many of them end up in Italy, where they are manumitted by the community there. And over the following centuries, they move northward and over the mountains into France and ultimately Germany. That is the origin of Ashkenazi Jews. Then there are the Jews who are in Persia, and again, the sort of widely accepted story, it's contested, but some of them sort of follow the Muslims in the 7th century as they move across the Middle East, across North Africa, and up into Spain. And this is particularly a good economic opportunity. So a lot of those Persian Jews who were presumably the ones who didn't go back to the land of Israel after the destruction of the First Temple and their exile to Babylonia, right? They sort of, so that's a very ancient community, and they sort of follow the Muslims up into the Iberian Peninsula, and that is kind of the origin of the Sephardi community. And then, right, as I said, there had been from temple times, right, from way before the Common Era, large community in Egypt. There was a significant community way down at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen and in Arabia as well, and of course other places. So, but we are typically familiar with the big communities of Sephardim and Ashkenazim. We should also pay attention, especially for the purposes of this discussion, to Italy. There was a very important Jewish community in Italy throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, and really into the 19th century. If you go to Rome, the Roman Jews will tell you that they are the only Jewish community in Europe that has existed continuously since the time of the destruction of the temple, although the Ancona Jews might have a claim on that as well, but there aren't so many of them at all. Okay, so we know what happens in 1492. The expulsion of the Spanish Jews was probably not intended to be an expulsion, but to be a way to get the Jews to convert and stay. But maybe between 1391, when anti-Jewish violence broke out, and 1492, the time of the expulsion, probably half of the Jews of Spain converted, and half left. Of those who left, a large number went to Portugal, where they were forcibly converted in 1497. So you have that concentration of conversos, particularly in Portugal and some in Spain. And when Spain essentially annexed Portugal between 1580 and 1640, a lot of the Portuguese conversos went to Spain, where the Inquisition hadn't had much to do with them for a long time, and it was a little less intense. Okay. Of those who left Spain in 1492 or managed to escape from Portugal after 1497, a lot of them went to the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire had been growing since well, it had been growing especially a lot in the 15th century. It knocked over the Eastern Christian center of Constantinople in 1453, and then continued on. It captured large parts of what had been the Byzantine Empire and Greece and Turkey, and captured the land of Israel. 1516, 17, they captured Egypt and the land of Israel, which had been under other Muslim rule. So that's kind of, as we go into the early modern period, that's kind of the state of things. Now, we speak about the Eastern and the Western Sephardi diasporas. So what's called the Eastern Sephardi diaspora is the diaspora of Jews who left Spain or Portugal, but mostly Spain, never really stopped practicing Judaism. And they went in particular to Istanbul, to Constantinople, to Saloniki, and also to Fez, and to some other places in North Africa. And they simply continued to practice Judaism. The Western Sephardi diaspora is delayed in its coming into existence about another century. So that really is a group of communities that comes into being probably starting around the 1580s or 90s at earliest. And it is made up of people of people whose ancestors had converted in Spain or Portugal in particular, back in the end of the 15th century, who had escaped, and for various reasons they did not want to go to the existing Sephardic communities in Saloniki or Kushta or Fez or wherever it was, probably because it was very uncomfortable for them there, because they, in many cases, had done very well living as Christians back in Spain or Portugal, had gotten an education that was not available to Jews, had succeeded financially in ways that most Jews weren't able to do. And now they escape, they come out, and they're looked down upon by the Jews in these large communities of Sephardim because they don't know anything about Judaism. They've never practiced Judaism. They may or may not have practiced certain things in secret, but those things, all told and put together, are not Judaism. So as my teacher, Yosef Kaplan, put it, essentially, when these people come out, some of them go ahead and create their own Jewish communities in Western Europe. And in many cases, the Jewish communities that they create are the first Jewish communities they have ever seen in their lives, which is a very odd situation. So essentially what some of these people do, and I want to emphasize, is not everybody, but as these Conversos, descendants of Conversos, escape from Spain and Portugal in the later 16th century and into the 17th century, some of them go to cities where Jews aren't allowed to live because they are they're not recognized outwardly as Jews. They're living as Iberian Catholics. So they go to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, to Livorno, to Bayonne, Bordeaux, Saint-Jean-de-Luz, and Hamburg, and London later. And they settle there as Catholics, and over the course of several decades, their secret sort of becomes open. They are able to create Jewish communities. So that is what is called the Western Sephardi diaspora. That is the diaspora of Jews who are themselves or are descended from Conversos. Okay. Another community that has a lot of former Conversos, but is not necessarily all former Conversos, is Izmir in the Ottoman Empire. Okay, now we get to the Sabbateans. So, one other thing to clarify. So in the Ottoman Empire and especially in Greece and Turkey in particular, there are a lot of Jews who are not Sephardim. They are what's called Romaniotes, which is they are descended from the Jews who had lived in that area before the Sephardim came. So they are Byzantine Jews, former Byzantine Jews, and their descendants. So they are different from Sephardim. Italian Jews are different from Sephardim. Yemenite Jews are different. Persian Jews are different. All those people are not Ashkenazim and they are not Sephardim. But Sephardic culture is so strong, and there are so many Sephardi exiles that when they do come to the Ottoman Empire, in many ways, they sort of wash away the former Byzantine Jewish culture. So that's the state that we're in. Now, Shabbatai Tzvi is a Jew living in Izmir, which is in Turkey, part of the Ottoman Empire. And he comes from a fairly wealthy family. His father's a businessman, works a lot with Europeans. And Shabbatai is born in 1626. His brothers tend more toward business. Shabbatai is an excellent student, and he becomes an accomplished rabbi. In 1648-49, there is a huge disaster for the Ashkenazi Jews. It was called Gezerot Tachvetat, the Khmelnytsky massacres and uprising, and it's followed by invasions of Ukraine and Poland by Sweden and Russia. It's there's about a decade there of really terrible times for the Polish and Ukrainian Jews. This doesn't affect Shabbatai Tzvi in Izmir very much, but he certainly hears about it, and that may or may not be, but very likely is, one of the things that sort of prodded his imagination. And in that time, in 1648, he told a few of his friends in the yeshiva in Izmir that he thought that he was the Mashiach. We don't know quite how everybody reacted. At least one of his friends, Rabbi Moshe Pinheiro, became a lifelong follower and believer. Other people, one or two others, seem to have stuck with it. We don't know about anybody else. So nothing comes of this. He keeps it between himself and these few friends. Over the next decade and a half, it appears that as Shabbatai is becoming a bigger Talmid Chacham, a more senior person, respected, something else is going on also, which is that he appears, and again, this is something that there may be people who argue against, but Gershom Scholem has nailed it down as closely as you ever can in psychohistory. He seems to be, Shabbatai seems to be bipolar. There's every indication that he goes into manic states and he does some odd things, and then he comes back down to an even state for a while, and then sometimes he goes down into a depression. And Sholem has followed him almost day to day over the period of the height of his movement, and has documented this, and it explains pretty much a lot about how he acted. He was also, Shabbatai Tzvi was also a Kabbalist, but he was not a what they call a Lurianic Kabbalist. That is to say, he was not particularly interested, he may have known, but he was not particularly interested in the Kabbalah of Rabbi Isaac Luria of the Arizal that had been created in Tzfat in the 16th century, about a century before his movement. Not so interested in that. He was interested in the Zohar and the Kana and Plia, which are medieval Kabbalistic works. He was very deeply involved in Kabbalah studies and Talmud studies and so on, and a recognized Talmid Chacham. He is living in Izmir And it's the 1660s, early 1660s, and he starts to do some weird stuff, presumably in his manic states. He announces that he's getting married, and all the rabbis and the dignitaries of the city come out, and he has himself married to a Torah scroll, a Sefer Torah. And he explains about what it means and the symbolism and so on, but he's essentially thrown out of the city for that strange kind of act. He wanders around for a while. He ends up in, I believe, in Saloniki, maybe around the middle of the 1660s, and seems to be okay for a while. And then people start seeing him pushing a baby stroller around the city, but he's not married, at least not to a person. And they look inside the baby stroller, and inside the stroller is a great big fish. And he gives this Kabbalistic explanation about the meaning of the fish and children and the ayin hara and all this stuff. And they again throw him out of the city. He wanders more. In 1665, or by 1665, he has ended up in Yerushalayim. And there he is again apparently able to maintain his even kind of a standing for a while, and he studies in the yeshiva, and he's a rabbi in Jerusalem, and as rabbis in Jerusalem at that time often were, he was asked by the rabbis of the city to go and collect money. They needed support, and there was a lot of poverty, and they asked him to go collect money for the yeshiva. Now, he had become, in his wanderings, close to a man called Raphael Chalabi. Raphael, who was the head of the Jewish community of Egypt, which was a wealthy Jewish community, but one with, I don't know, a kind of dangerous standing. Anyway, he was welcomed by this man and had taken in, and he raised money with him and so on. At a certain point, Shabtai started getting these feelings again that maybe he is the Mashiach. Maybe he is the Mashiach. And he tells Raphael Chalabi, and he is told that maybe he can get a tikkun, that he can find out what's going on with him and understand the situation and so on. He didn't have psychologists at that time. You had Kabbalists. So the Chalabi sends him to a young man, 22 years old, who is already a famous Kabbalist, and he is in the city of Gaza, and his name is Nathan of Gaza, referred to later as Natan HaZati. So Shabtai goes to him, and instead of being told that he is imagining it or that he's having fantasies or something, Nathan of Gaza tells Shabtai that he is indeed the Mashiach. Shabtai isn't quite ready to believe this, and essentially Nathan of Gaza talks him into it, and from then on their fates are locked together, even though they don't see much of each other after this. Shavuot night, 1665, Nathan of Gaza, Shabbatai, a bunch of rabbis who are mostly shlichim for the communities of the land of Israel. That is to say, they are emissaries who are going to go collect money various places. They gather on Shavuot night. Nathan of Gaza has an incredible prophecy, a very dramatic, and he prophesies that Shabbatai Tzvi is indeed the Mashiach. From there, the movement builds. It spreads out. These emissaries, of course, go wherever they were going to collect money, various places in Greece, in Ottoman Turkey, in Syria, other places. And as they go, they spread the word. And these are important rabbis of great standing. And their word is taken very seriously, and the movement grows. Letters come from the land of Israel and so on. And eventually Shabbatai himself goes to the Ottoman Empire, back to Izmir, and then afterwards to Saloniki. And the movement spreads tremendously. Eventually comes to the attention of the vizier, Mehmed Kuprulu, and Shabbatai is arrested. As the situation was in Turkey at that time, if you spread a little money around, jail is not so bad. And he essentially turns his prison cell into a reception center where Jews from all over the Jewish world come to meet him, to check him out, to hear words from him. And as this happens, the movement spreads even more, and people wonder why the Ottomans have been so generous with him, why he's able to live like this. And eventually an Ashkenazi, it's got to be an Ashkenazi, right? A Polish Jew named Nehemiah Cohen comes, visits him, has apparently a long argument with him behind closed doors, walks out, converts to Islam on the spot, denounces Shabbatai Tzvi as a traitor to the Ottoman state, and then goes back to Poland, where he presumably goes back to being a Jewish rabbi. Shabbatai is brought up a second time before the vizier and the sultan. He almost certainly would have been beheaded on the spot, but somebody suggests to him that if he converts to Islam, he can save himself. Now, anybody who knows the history of messiahs and messianism knows what's supposed to happen at this point. What's supposed to happen is that he allows himself to be martyred, and then he's sort of Jesus all over again, right? The Jew who's martyred and was supposed to be the Messiah and so on. But he doesn't do that. He converts to Islam, and the people who believed in him were so deeply invested and convinced. Many of them abandon the movement and they're embarrassed and so on. But there's a significant number of people who stay with the movement, even as Shabbatai lives out the rest of his life, the next 10 years until he dies in 1676 as a Muslim. But sometimes he acts more or less like a Muslim, and sometimes he acts like the Jewish Messiah. And he kind of goes in waves, probably following his bipolar issues. Eventually, he is exiled to a place way out in the far reaches of the empire. But the movement continues not only after he converts, it continues even after he dies. And as we were speaking about just before we started, there are still people who are at least nominally members of a group that follow Shabbatai Tzvi and view him as the Messiah. There are people who remain within the Jewish world and are followers or believers. There are people who imitate Shabbatai Tzvi's conversion to Islam, and especially in the early 1680s, there's a large group in Saloniki, including a lot of rabbis who convert to Islam. Those are the people who become known as the Donmeh or the Ma'aminim, who are still around. There are complicated relationships between all the believers, the leaders of the believers, the different groups, there are different attitudes, there are different theories about whether Shabbatai is going to come back at some time soon, or whether it's going to be further in the future, what it's going to be like, how it's going to work, all of those things. I want to mention one other thing that's important in understanding before we talk about who the leaders of the movement were, that is, and where they're from. That is that in his manic states, Shabbatai Tzvi would often do what were described by the believers as strange acts. Essentially, he would transgress mitzvot, commandments of Judaism publicly, often saying beracha before he did it, and explain that there's a Kabbalistic reason why he has to do this ritual transgression. It's not something to just enjoy himself by breaking Jewish law. It's a ritual, Kabbalistically determined act that he would do on certain occasions. And he was known for this. That's the very first sort of modern essay by Gershom Sholem about the Sabbatean movement was called Mitzvah Haba Ba'avera, the commandment that is fulfilled by transgression. And that was kind of the way that this kind of act was described. And of course, maybe the ultimate transgression was converting away from Judaism. So that is a very, very short version of the story of Shabbatai Tzvi and his movement. So we wanted to talk about the roles of people from different parts of the Jewish world in this movement. So Shabbatai Tzvi himself would be our first person to discuss. For a long time, people thought that he was a Sephardi because he spoke Spanish and he used to sing romanceros all the time. That was kind of his thing. He had a great voice, apparently. So his scholars had assumed that he was a Sephardi, but more recent scholarship suggests that he was in fact a Romaniote, that he was a Byzantine, descended from Byzantine Jews, a Romaniote, even though he had a lot of Sephardi culture, because in Izmir, where he lived, right, that was essentially a Sephardi community. His prophet, who was the second most important figure in the movement and extremely influential, Nathan of Gaza, was an Ashkenazi. He's described as Natan HaAshkenazi in a lot of the literature. So he's an Ashkenazi. But there's a second prophet of the movement who's very important. Not quite as much as Nathan, but extremely influential. And his name is Avraham Miguel Cardoso. Cardoso is not only a Sephardi, he is a former converso. He was born in Rio Seco, Spain, and grew up as a Christian of converso origins. And as a young adult, he left Spain and he went to Italy, and he ends up moving all over the place. He spends really the rest of his life moving all over. He is a physician. He's trained as a physician and apparently somewhat successful at that. He's got several wives and kind of an entourage, and he moves around. But he, when Shabbatai Tzvi converts to Islam, this Abraham Miguel Cardoso writes about the meaning of that act. And he says it had to happen that according to the Kabbalah, and he really is speaking in terms of the Lurianic Kabbalah, the Kabbalah of the Ari, there are sparks of holiness which are buried in the the non-Jewish nether regions of the spiritual world. And the only way for the world to be redeemed is for the Mashiach to go down and dig out and find those sparks of holiness and bring them back up and use them. And the only way that the Mashiach can do that is by converting out of Judaism and being spurned and hated by everybody for it and so on. And he cites certain passages from the prophets that is going to be the fate of the Messiah. And he says, and he literally says this, the Mashiach is going to have to be a converso like I am, an anus. He is going to have to be like me. He's going to have to be that person who has left Judaism and lives as a non-Jew and is spurned and hated for that before he can come back and finish his mission as the Mashiach. So he is one converso. There are a lot of conversos and descendants of conversos who are very involved in the movement. And Professor Yaakov Barnai has suggested, and other people have brought this up, that it's possible that their upbringing as Christians back in Spain and Portugal, right? Christianity is a religion that it grows out of Judaism. It's born in Judaism, but it's built around the Mashiach. Before Jesus became God, he was the Mashiach. So Christianity has a big emphasis on messianism and Messiah. And so people have suggested that even when conversos return to Judaism, they still have a strong messianic focus or interest, and that Shabtai Tzvi sort of grabbed onto that aspect of the converso persona, and that is why so many important conversos became followers. So in the communities of conversos that I mentioned, the Western Sephardi diaspora, in Hamburg, in London, in Amsterdam, in Livorno, some of the strongest following of Shabtai Tzvi was in those cities and with those conversos in their communities. He also had a very strong following in Italy. So Italy had several communities that had large numbers of former conversos and their descendants. Italy was also sort of geographically at the center of the Jewish world. So in Livorno in particular, in Venice, and to a lesser degree in Rome, other places, there was a large following. And right, if you sort of picture Italy between the Ottoman Empire and the rest and the rest of Europe, right? It became a conduit. A lot of the booklets, the news sheets, the letters, the messages about Shabtai Tzvi went through Italy. Sometimes they were edited there, sometimes not well. Sometimes they were translated and sent on into the European Jewish community. So the Italian Jews played a big part in the movement. And later, after the conversion, over the next several decades, the movement, the center of the movement sort of shifted from the Sephardi world. It didn't disappear from there. Saloniki, for example, remained a major center, and there were centers in Egypt and Morocco and Yemen, but a lot of emphasis shifted to northern Italy, and a little bit later even to Ashkenaz. But what you end up with is a much larger sort of diaspora, let's call it, or spread of Sabbatean centers. So somebody asked, before his conversion to Islam, what traits would you credit as the reason that conversos followed him? And again, I would say it's because he was the Mashiach. It was because major rabbis had recognized him as the Mashiach And I would say the Converso mindset, at least this is the theory. Again, this is Professor Barnai and other people, right? The theory is that Christians who had grown up with a Messiah at the center of their religiosity were perhaps particularly open or particularly welcoming to a real Jewish Messiah as they perceived it, right? The real Jewish Messiah, after they had left Christianity and left Jesus, but still had grown up with this focus on the importance of the Messiah that Shabtai Tzvi, as somebody who was convincing to their rabbis, convincing to leaders in the Jewish world, kind of filled that place for them. That now Judaism was sort of complete because it was everything that they had rejoined when they rejoined the Jewish community. Plus now the Messiah is here. That's much more, let's say, recognizable to them. So that's kind of the theory. So that is kind of where you can see, and again, this is kind of thumbnail. I mean, there's really so much right under the surface of everything that I've said, but this gives you at least a sense of where Sephardim, Conversos, Italian Jews, and Romaniotes were involved in the Sabbatean movement. So I don't know, I've spoken for about 40 minutes. I don't know if people want to ask questions or if there are particular areas that you would like me to go into further to discuss.
I have a question, if it's all right, Dr. Goldish. This is Rabbi Juan. In your book, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little quiet, but let me see
Yes,
if I can turn up my volume.
I wondered if you could just briefly describe, I mentioned it in the very beginning of the introduction before we sort of went live, about the sessions or the services that these Sabbateans would have. And what I read in your book, Sabbatean Prophets, was these kind of, I don't know what word to use, almost like a charismatic type of experiences that these people were having. And I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and just maybe explain, where did that come from?
Okay. I see we've got Papo calling Shabtai transgender Messiah. Is attributed a lot of female traits. Well, if you're interested in that subject, that's not where I would go for that discussion. I would look at the book by Ada Rappaport Albert called Women in the Sabbatean Movement, something like that. Quite extensive, quite detailed. There's been a lot written. I'm sorry, Rabbi, I'm going to get to the point in a minute. I just want to address this. There's been a lot written about Shabtai and sexuality, Shabtai and gender issues, and there is a lot there. There's definitely a lot to talk about there. He is very complicated in that way. I talk about a little of it in my book. Ada talks a lot about it in her book. Then there's some popular material which I would not rely on. There's a book that came out in Israel called something like Mashiach Shel Gilui Arayot, right? The Messiah of Forbidden Relationships. Right, the author, I'll show you the book right now. Give me a second. There it is. Okay, and that is Ada Rappaport Albert, who Allah HaShalom passed away a year or two ago. Was an outstanding scholar. So this book is a high quality work. Anyway, okay, so I hope that yeah, it's published by the Littman Library, so it's not cheap, but it's not as expensive as some academic books. All right, I'm sure, Rabbi, that you probably have a lot of books from their list. Yeah, it's maybe on an engineer's salary. You can afford them. Professors have a hard time, but anyway, never mind. Okay, the services. So it's not so much the religious services that I was describing as really my book. Well, I'll explain what I was doing in the book, and that will make this point maybe a little clearer. Shabbatai Tzvi, right, the big question that people have is, how was the movement successful? Why did people believe that this particular guy could be the Mashiach? Why him? What was it about him? And was it really convincing? Why was it convincing to people? So Gershom Sholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, who wrote this 1,000-page tome on Shabtai Tzvi, which is really the benchmark forever on that subject, he says, in his opinion, the common element that brought together Jews from all these different communities that made them think that Shabtai was the Mashiach is that his message was delivered in the language of Lurianic Kabbalah, and that Lurianic Kabbalah had spread all over the Jewish world, and that people were fascinated by it. And when Shabtai's message is put forward in the language of Lurianic Kabbalah, that lots of people found that convincing and magnetizing. And so this is the famous thesis. It's been chipped away at pretty seriously by my teacher Moshe Idel and by others. And I proposed an alternate theory. And my theory is, right, there's a problem because Shabtai himself was not a Lurianic Kabbalist. And there's another problem that, as Idel proved, Kabbalah wasn't nearly as popular as Sholem presented it to be. And furthermore, the booklets, the pamphlets, the theological treatises by Nathan of Gaza, by Abraham Miguel Cardoso, and so on, that explain the meaning of Shabbatai and his message and so on, they reached the Jewish world after the movement was already huge. It was, in other words, they pushed it on, but the movement had already spread before those messages in the language of Lurianic Kabbalah. So there's some problems with Sholem. My thesis is that what really made people pay attention to Shabtai Tzvi and convinced these important rabbis on Shavuot night in 1665 and then afterwards was that Shabtai, his wife, later wife Sarah, Cardoso, Nathan of Gaza, were all prophets, and they all prophesied. Well, I won't go into it in detail here, but they were prophets, and there was a huge movement of popular prophecy that followed that Shavuot event in later 1665 and in 1666, that all over in the Jewish world, rabbis, women, children, ordinary people suddenly started spouting prophecy. And often that went together with some very weird physical phenomena and so on. It's comparable, for example, on one hand to the early Quakers, who are called Quakers because they would fall into these prophetic ecstasies and quake and shake and so on. And then on the other hand, it bears a lot of resemblance to the Sufis and the Kalendars and the dervishes of the Ottoman Empire, who also had phenomena like these kind of prophetic physical phenomena. So those things were happening all over, and people saw that, and it's not like today, when you turn on your TV and there's special effects everywhere you look, and you can watch the latest animated, whatever. And it wasn't like that. So seeing, especially members of your own community, ordinary people going to prophetic ecstasies, my claim is that is what really brought Jews everywhere into the movement and convinced them, starting from its very beginning. So that's where you get those weird, and you mentioned, Rabbi, that it seems similar to revival meetings and certain Protestant religious. There are also, by the way, in this very same time, there are also Catholic religious phenomena that are somewhat similar to this, right? So those are some of the things that I bring up and discuss in the book. And very strange for people and very enticing to see that going on. So somebody wrote me another question here. Do you know something about the use of ladino in the songs composed in his honor? So yes. First of all, Shabtai himself loved singing these Spanish romanceros and other songs, and he interpreted them in a Kabbalistic way and a Messianic way and so on. And so did a lot of his followers. The Chazan, the cantor at the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in Hamburg, wrote a book called Fin de los Dias. It's sort of a poem song in honor of Shabtai Tzvi. And then there was a lot of other material written by rabbis and by lay people honoring him. And a lot of it was in Spanish and Ladino in various versions of Judeo-Spanish. And as you know, there are quite a number of those. So a lot of these were preserved, strangely enough, by the Donmeh, by these Ma'aminim who converted to Islam, and they kept them very secret. And it was a whole big thing about their secret writings. But at the time of World War I, when their entire community was picked up and displaced and forced out of Saloniki and taken to Istanbul and so on, some elders or leaders of the community turned over their archives to some Israeli researchers. And there's some very nice publications, especially a book published in Israel called Shirot V'Tishbachot Shel HaShabtaim, songs and hymns of the Sabbateans, and they're in Judeo-Spanish of various types. And then my friend Aviel Kayam at Bar Ilan University has published more of this material, and he's worked with some other people and done some translations and some analysis. Hadar Feldman, maybe she's at the Hebrew University now, has also worked on this material. So it's strange that a lot of that has passed down through the Donmeh specifically, right? It's sort of lost to the Jewish world of Sabbateans, but it was preserved by the Donmeh. But there are other pieces that we still have from the origins of the movement, where you see some of the poetry and the works in Judeo-Spanish. So I hope that addressed those questions a little bit. Rabbi, anything else that you'd like me to expand on? Or
I think I'm still curious about, obviously rabbis supported him. I understand that aspect, but was Shabbatai Tzvi, I mean, is he like a charismatic personality? What is it that drew him? Obviously, he's a Talmid Chacham, he's someone who's learned, but what is it that we know about him that was so magnetizing, or that people really seem to add credibility to these claims? I mean, obviously, if you're at a distance, I could see where there's a little bit of a euphoria, frenzy, you just sort of get involved with it. But do we know anything about the people that were closest to him, and what did they see in him? I guess that's sort of intriguing to me.
So the very first thing I would say, and this is Gershom Scholem really makes this point, and I think that he's completely correct about this, is that the movement really starts more with Nathan of Gaza than it does with Shabtai himself. And Nathan, I mean, picture this. He's a kid. He's 22 years old. He's the age of my students at Ohio State University. And he is a famous Kabbalist already at that point. He is charismatic, and he's also known far and wide for his wisdom and his knowledge of Kabbalah and his holy lifestyle. He's always fasting and all of this. And people are coming to Gaza. Gaza is like Chillicothe, Ohio. It's not a place that you just happen to pass through by accident. You got to decide to go there, right? And people come to see him from all over the Jewish world. So he is a huge part of right, his authority and his attachment and belief in Shabbatai, and especially this wild prophecy on Shavuot night where he jumps up in the air and lands flat on his back and seems to be dead. And then this disembodied voice comes out of his throat prophesying that Shabtai is the Mashiach, right? That certainly was extremely influential on the people who witnessed it. Shabtai himself, Sholem, again, I think proves as much as you can prove anything in history, about this bipolar situation. I think that this is a common or widespread among bipolar people, and it was especially true of Shabtai, that when he was in his manic states, he was apparently so magnetic, so charismatic, that people describe his face as sort of shining, right? And he'd sing in his voice that people loved, and he'd make pronouncements that sometimes sounded wild, and he'd have Kabbalistic explanations for everything, and he'd welcome visitors and give them special gifts that he said would have special significance for them, and so on. So this pair, right, they really it's really between them that there's all this charisma and all this kind of Kabbalistic wisdom and power. I gave a paper once in which I talked about the two-leader paradigm. We in the West, especially here in America, especially you down in the Southwest, right? You right, we have this kind of American thing about individualism, and the individual, the person who pulls himself up by his bootstraps and makes a success, and blah blah blah. Very, very Texas, right? Shabtai and Nathan exemplify a sort of two-leader paradigm, and each would not, the movement would not have taken off without both of them. So you've got the charisma and the wisdom. You've got the face of the movement, and then the theology of the movement. Right, the two of them together. I compared it to Lahavdil Elef Alfei Havdalot. I'm scared to say this in front of a rabbi, but Jesus and Paul, right, who never met each other, but without both of them, Christianity wouldn't have become what it is, right? They say that Paul McCartney and John Lennon, right, in the Beatles, that they, right, you need both of them. They play off each other, and on, right? There are other examples of this sort of two-leader paradigm. So for me, I think that is part of what made it work, as you correctly point out, right, for people who were close to them, who saw them, who came in actual contact with them. And then there's this whole spreading prophetic movement among people who were further away. But the the rabbis, right? The rabbis are at first convinced because Nathan of Gaza is a person of such stature, and the rabbis who saw that Shavuot night prophecy, also well-known figures, men of stature in the communities. And once that starts, it sort of it takes off like a snowball. I think I put in a footnote maybe in my book. There's a famous book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point. And if you look at that book, it's really about how social movements spread, and it tells you a lot that's helpful for understanding how the Sabbatean movement spread.
Well, I think that I thank you so much for the presentation. I don't know if anyone else has any questions, but I think it's an excellent overview. I mean, there's so many different directions you could take it in. Just to note, Milton asked a question about the Ladino songs and so forth. There's a song from the community in Amsterdam called Ya Vendrá, about essentially it's, Mashiach will come, and in the future. But what I read, I'm not sure if it was in your book or in another book, at the time they actually changed it to Ya Viene, like he is coming, and it was a direct reference to Shabbatai Zvi, and it's just amazing the kind of momentum that built, and to the extent that liturgy was being changed,
Yeah.
and we actually incorporated that song on special occasions in our synagogue, the original version, not the but it's just interesting to see that piece of history, sort of alive, and how it was used, by the people that were enamored and just supportive of Shabbatai Zvi. So I think
Right.
there's one more comment here. I don't know if you saw it or not, but
Um,
okay, they're just I think thinking. Final question. I'm not sure. Oh, I think I think you've gotten that. Just
okay.
yeah. Well,
I
thank you.
feel bad. I feel as if there's so much more that I could say, but I kind of truncated a lot of things at the beginning so I wouldn't run out of time.
No,
And
no,
I thought
that's okay.
maybe people would have other thoughts or questions. So I hope I've covered what people were interested in.
No, I think an overview is excellent. I think a lot of people have heard of the movement, but they just sort of maybe read it in a passing sense. And I think you provided. I think the context is really what is fascinating to me. The other religious movements, the Quakers, Catholic, mysticism, whatever it is, Sufis, and so forth. I think that is something that we often miss when we look at these phenomena. We sort of lose focus and don't understand the environment, and I think that's critical. So thank you so much. Hopefully in the future, maybe we can have you on a different topic. I'm fascinated by Newton. I know you
Sure.
wrote a book on that too. So
Happy to
maybe
talk about Newton, happy to talk about Sephardim and Conversos, which I've also worked on, and whatever you like.
absolutely. And you wrote a book on Sephardic responsa.
Right,
So yeah,
right.
that was a
Tons of
hard
fun.
question, hard call for me, to choose the topics, but
Okay.
maybe for the future, B'ezrat Hashem. So
Happy to come back. Thank you.
well, thank you so much, and we'll be in contact.
Okay. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.